Hey, welcome back to another Bitcoin Reformation Podcast. I'm Ben Haupt here with Jared Townley and David Ruffner to talk more about Bitcoin. Little update from me real quick. I have been on the road traveling. I have been all around the US in October, and then at the beginning of November was in Argentina. Got to spend a little bit of time right in front of Casa Rosada, which is where President Milei lives or works. And President Milei, the new president of Argentina, is beloved by Bitcoiners as a conservative voice that really is interested in taking back control of the monetary situation of Argentina. And he is definitely friendly to Bitcoin. It was fascinating to talk with the Argentinians about Milei, because in some ways Milei could be seen as a very controversial and maybe even an extremist of sorts, and yet everybody that I talked to in Argentina was just raving fans of him. Even his approach to things like poverty, they just recognized, I mean, these were Christians that have a deep sense of taking care of the poor and taking care of their neighbor. And yet they said, we can't afford not to take care of our financial situation. Things have been so bleak. Where we've seen in the US 10% inflation, they've seen hundreds of percent increases in inflation. And they said that this year, the economy is better than they've seen in a long, long time. And their economy is inflating, I think, even less than what the US is right now. And so it was just fascinating to be with them. So exciting to be around the world a little bit and to get to see some of the places and characters and talk with folks that are dealing with real life stuff. So this inflation thing and hyperinflation is not just some theory or some worry of some kind of marginalized figures in the US. This is real life stuff, and it was just fun to hear from them.
Did you have any good Argentinian steak, Ben?
I went to an Argentinian steakhouse. I went to two great places for, one was for lunch and then followed by an amazing dinner in Buenos Aires. And I'm telling you, it was fantastic. I have pictures of these buffets that I was at, and everything that I had there was just fantastic. So I told Selena I could easily go back to Buenos Aires, and got to know some people from Cordoba, which is in northern Argentina up in the mountains. And I didn't get to go there, but from everything that I learned about it was fascinated. The guy that was from Cordoba was a German speaker. And so
I was wondering,
because my Spanish is non-existent, he doesn't speak much English. We spoke German. And we got along really, really well. There's a bunch of German Lutherans settled in Argentina, kind of like in Brazil, after things kind of went south in Prussia in the late 19th century.
Yeah.
So yeah, fascinating stuff. So, Jared, how are things your way?
I've been thinking the last couple of days about kid stories and like trying to come up with a good one. So I think the best one, we talked in the last episode about the Tuttle Twins episode. And so I made my daughter, and that's intentional there, I made her watch the song, the song from the episode, which basically goes, when money is controlled, money is corrupted. And it's just a very catchy tune. And so we watched the 2-minute song, and then my daughter the rest of the day was walking around the house saying, when money is controlled, money is corrupted. And it was like a proud Bitcoin dad moment for me. But other than that, I think the biggest thing going on in my life, I just finished reading the book Fiat Food, which was incredibly exactly what I thought it was going to be, if you will, in that sense, and is really challenged and is changing me, I think. So long story short here, I've been like a plant-based vegan kind of person for plus years now, I think, or so. And I think I'm going to start eating meat here pretty soon.
Whoa.
So I don't know exactly what that means or looks like fully, but just the book itself was very surprising. A lot of like basic nutrition stuff that I think so many of us would say is common sense or like common knowledge. The author tries to claim has both no basis in science, but also it was heavily influenced and even forced upon people as sort of trying to fill the coffers of big agro, big science stuff, and that the government plays a role in all those. It's a very, he said at the beginning, it's going to read like a crime novel. And it really did read like one of those, oh, this is like, wow, Emily, listen to this. Can you believe this? Like, this actually happened. And like, these are the people that are funding this heart health thing, but they're the people that want you to buy their vegetable oils and like all of these just like really wild stuff. So if you're at all curious about that, I would recommend it just from the sense of like, it's very different picture of maybe what you might think about when you think about nutrition and where things come from. I think one of the things that is like a fun fact, if you will, that Frosted Flakes or just bran flakes in general were originally started by Seventh-day Adventist guy to stop people from self-pleasuring themselves, basically. And I had never heard that before. And it's all about this sort of like weird obsession with trying to get people to not lust after other people because they truly believe that it was in red meat, that's why you had that sinful desire, which like we as Christians like just kind of laugh at. But I mean, it's like truly what these people believe and kind of where we get all of this, graham crackers. The same reason why those were made was for that very reason. And so it's just kind of wild, crazy, funny, disturbing, whatever word you want to fill in there. So that's my big crazy change in my life, that I think I'm going to eat meat. And I promise Ben, who's sitting on the other side of this wall, that he could be the first one to cook me a steak in 6 years or so. So I'm really, I think I can say I'm excited. Maybe I'm excited to see what that looks like and kind of how it might even make me more healthy as I continue to sort of live on. So crazy stuff here.
Did that book reference Wendell Berry at all? I'm curious.
No, it did not. It did not.
I mean, that sounds in some ways, I mean, Wendell Berry is, I would say he's very kind of anti-technology in lots of ways, but his stuff on food is pretty deeply aware of the big problems in industrial agriculture. And I could see in many ways that a Wendell Berry approach to food would probably go right along with kind of some kind of treatment of Fiat food as bad for health and bad for membership in community and that sort of thing. So fascinating stuff.
Oh yeah, we could probably talk a whole bunch more about that some other time.
There's a really bad movie in the early 90s. Dana Carvey was in it. And it's a pseudo history of what you're just talking about. I don't know how close it follows with that, but it's a bonkers movie, and that whole episode in history was bonkers. And I think an interesting portion of that, Jared, is that sort of thinking. And I can think of other sciences that were fad sciences, such as phrenology, the study of the shape of skulls as a determining science as to how smart somebody was or whole ethnicities were. These were quote unquote settled sciences at one point, which we can think of our own episodes recently of settled science. But may science ever be discovering, may we all have the curiosity that you have, Jared, to keep reading and being challenged. So awesome for you. And I wrote it down. I probably have to get Fiat food now.
Absolutely. So that's what's going on in my world, David. What's going on in yours?
Well, I think I'll be slightly quick. Let's see. Child number 3, which is son 3 of 3, just got his driver's license last week. So we are even more in the poorhouse than ever before. With the Ruffner 6, 4 of us are now drivers. 4 drivers, 4 vehicles. I take that back. 5 drivers, 4 vehicles. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous, but it's a joy. The fun part is the other morning, it was time for them to go to school, and he's like, "Where's Dad? Where's Dad?" I was in a meeting, early morning meeting. He says, "Where's Dad?" And my wife said, "Why?" She's like, "We got to get to school." He forgot. That he had his license. He forgot that he was the driver guy now. So that was kind of fun.
Priceless.
And then one other thing, the daughter who's a freshman, so that's the sophomore boy, the daughter who's a freshman has a boy that likes her. And I was giving them the stink eye at a basketball game Monday night, a few nights ago. And Eden came home just laughing. She said, "This boy," I won't say his name here, says, "I don't think your dad likes me." And my daughter said, "I don't think it's that he dislikes you as a person. It's just that he dislikes that you like me." And I was like, ding, ding, ding. Spot on, daughter, spot on. And if this poor kid, as if that's not bad enough, she has, 3 older brothers. All the kids will be home from college and the like here in coming days. And there's plenty of basketball games over Thanksgiving break. So I'm looking forward to seeing this kid squirm.
If he was a Bitcoiner, would that make things better?
If he asked good questions, sure, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Hey, and we can't go anywhere else. I mean, we're recording this on November 20th, and none of us have mentioned the price of Bitcoin, which, we don't want to timestamp everything, but I've not yet posted on Facebook. We just released the why every church should buy or nonprofit should buy Bitcoin. But we recorded that when the price was in the 60s.
Yep.
And today it was hitting up in 94,000. So, I mean, if that episode was true a month and a half ago, so even more so today. So, sorry, can't have an episode when price is like way up here without mentioning it, at least before we keep going anywhere else.
It's wild. I'm starting to get the texts and conversations that I was not getting a month ago. And we talked about that a little bit in texting leading up to this episode. The 3 of us did for our listeners. And it's interesting. We're really excited, probably, if you've been squirreling away, right? If you've been saving in the store of value and now you have topside, you're excited. What does not excite you is the idea that friends or listeners, in this case, friends and listeners, would say, "Oh my goodness, I was curious, but now I missed it." It is true that if you started saving in Bitcoin a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, you were earlier, but it is not true that means that you now are late in terms of starting. So don't fall into that fallacy. Don't be emotional in that way. Look at Bitcoin, ask yourself, why is it going up? And do those fundamentals persist at 94,000? Do they persist north of 94,000? And anyways, there you go.
Yeah, I think we all could say that we, all 3 of us, continue to be buyers of Bitcoin. And it's not like we got in early and then we just have held and haven't bought anymore since our first purchase or whatever. We're all into what's called dollar cost averaging, which means just continuing to buy as you go. And some of the research that I've done is that if you start buying at the absolute peak when things are just bonkers wild, and you buy, even if there is some kind of bear market, if you buy all along from the peak to the trough, you're way better off than if you try to wait for some kind of bottom or bear market to buy again. You're far better off to buy at the peak. So this isn't financial advice, but I'm a buyer of Bitcoin, frankly, at any price.
That's right. Well, we're going to start an episode today. We might not finish it. And it's actually nice saying that, because then we maybe have room to breathe, even as in another sense we don't have room to breathe. I think collectively have a hard stop at a particular time today. And I'm realizing now that finally the 3 of us are here together, it's too much fun to do it with all 3 of us to say it's all right for 2 of 3. That might be fine for multi-sigs, but we're going to stick to 3 hosts here. I think will work well for today. I propose an idea. We have talked about some of the specifics of Bitcoin itself. We can get down into the dirty technicals of Bitcoin. And at that point, we're talking about supply cap. We're talking about supply issuance. We're talking about how divisible is Bitcoin. We're talking about decentralized. We're talking about nodes. We've had that episode in the past, and certainly we'll talk more about those things to come. But on this Bitcoin journey for the three of us, it has caused us to bump into larger conversations outside of the technicals of just Bitcoin itself, and particularly conversations having to do with economics and even sociology. Sociological terms, or in those two spheres of economics and sociology, that very much relate to Bitcoin, and knowledgeable conversations about it. And it's kind of nice. The more you can, I think of terms as if you get a handle on the terms, now you've got a handle or a hook, right? And I know hooks right inside my front door are highly valuable to our home. A little piece of technology, but boy, if you can see the number of hats and coats and sweatshirts that are on a hook, just highly valuable. And so we want to begin presenting, I think in this episode, again, we'll see how far we get, is some of these terms and have fun discussions around them individually. They tend to flow one from the next, or they kind of build, but each in its own way then provides us, the three of us, and hopefully our listeners, sort of new hooks, or maybe we're just being reminded of these things, but hooks that we can think about the world and we can hang things on, and they're just helpful in life. So having said all that, enough kind of initial words, enough prolegomena. Let's jump into it here. I think the first term that came to mind for me, and I had never heard it, I knew of the concept, I'd never heard of who it was attributed to until it was the Bitcoin world, but it's called Dunbar's number. I did not dig up the information on Dunbar himself. As with many things in life, they're named after a location, a school of thought, or even an individual. Dunbar, I believe, was maybe an economist in England, if I'm remembering back, many decades ago, if not 100 years or more ago. But Dunbar came up with a theoretical limit that a group size could have and have in a stable relationship. And when I say stable relationship, maybe you could just say a theoretical number of how many individuals can you have where you can have a meaningful relationship with each of the individuals. But beyond that number, you simply cannot. There's not enough of you. There's not enough of them to go around. You begin to know them in an abstracted way, but not in an intimate way. And we all could pick our own number there. But Dunbar's number, particularly thinking of communities, you could think of then a work size, you could think of your neighborhood, a local club, or, and this is where I first kind of bumped into this number, this specific number, your local church. Dunbar's number is 150. And Dunbar proposed that beyond 150, you begin to have it's no longer intimate. You now have to look at organizational behavior. There's more hierarchies. The social relationships are strained. And then Dunbar's number, taken into economics, says that beyond 150 people, you can't barter very well anymore. If it's lower number than that, you can live by barter. But notice when you do barter, you're kind of keeping track of who owes who, right? I'll scratch your back today so that next week you can scratch my back. And we have all these individual ledgers between individual people. But the problem beyond 150 is you begin to break down in your ability to have what they call a coincidence of wants and needs. So isn't it great? Not only does Jared have his first steak in 6 years, but he's so in on it that he gets himself, he gets himself a couple acres of a farm, and now he's raising, right? He's raising livestock. He's got beef on the hoof, and it's beautifully marbled. It's well fed, all organic, all that's great. Well, that's a highly valuable good, but does it really match up with a good that somebody else is offering? So beyond 150, and I'll get real quickly to the point then, beyond 150 people, what you find in social systems is that you move beyond bartering and you move to where there's a currency that in and of itself acts as a real-time ledger for everybody. right? Instead of Ben and I and Jared and I having our own individual ledgers, we're all start to begin to work on some sort of monetary system, some sort of currency whereby we use it as the intermediary between what Jared's offering, what I'm offering, what Ben needs, what I need. And so that happens. So Dunbar's number explains to us why money and not barter. And I've been talking for a bit, so I'll come up for air and give it to these guys. Have you heard of Dunbar's number in past years?
I think my interaction comes from the same place as yours, David, with church. I don't know if it was Ben, your class, or somebody else's leadership class that talked about sort of, hey, this applies to you as pastor, that you can do about 150, but then you need to start thinking about whether it's a DCE or whatever. Your personal cap is that sort of ceiling that you're going to start bumping into if you get up to 150. So other than that, though, the Bitcoin is the only other place I've really heard this talked about.
Yeah, I came across this number listening to Malcolm Gladwell, and he very much was the popularizer of it, I think in his book Tipping Point. And I definitely did talk about it in leadership class, but it's possible that it really sank in somebody else's class. Who knows? All of that kind of stuff that happens at seminary, it's all just kind of like information that just rattles around. But I do think, especially if there are any Lutherans or pastors or just Christians in general in the U.S., the idea of a small church being kind of a really good idea just makes sense, and that the small church has a sense in which it really feels comfortable. This is where it comes from. There's no theological thing that says a church must be under 150, but sociologically, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. Now, I'm also a big fan of large churches, and I think large churches have been around since the beginning of the Christian church. After all, very quickly on after Pentecost, there were very quickly many more than 150, although think of the number of disciples that were in the upper room, 120. They did not reach past the Dunbar number. That's fascinating. But when 3,000 people in one day became Christians, they had to figure this out. I think that people have been wrestling with this for a long time. It just means if you're at a larger church that you have to find new ways for people to relate to one another and have these intimate relationships. What does this have to do with Bitcoin? Well, you got to figure out a way for people to interact and exchange things if they can't necessarily know every person individually. I mean, I was even thinking about this just in terms of the United States or nation states in general. The reason that nation states work is because we have this nationalized police system where if your neighbor that you don't know comes over in the middle of the night and tries to take stuff, you call the 911 and the nation state, right, takes care of it. So it eliminates some of this need for trust. But when you're talking a monetary system, that becomes a much more challenging thing, because who is the money police?
Yeah, who is the money police? And we haven't even begun to answer a question that could easily bubble up to our minds, is like, who issues the money in this case, right? Where does the money come from? It turns out, apparently through much of world history, human history, it just sort of bubbled up. I listened to Guy Swan, great podcast. I really liked his old stuff years ago. He read he'd read a quirky paper about like Dunbar's number, which seemingly did not have an immediate connection to Bitcoin. He'd read the paper. It was bright and brilliant on its own. And then in his Guy's take afterwards, he would draw the connections. But he pointed out any number of things have worked as payment in the past, like literally back to Jared's future herd of cattle, or dowries, right? But the problem with cattle dowries I mean, a cow is highly divisible. It just needs to be used up right away then, right? So in one sense, it's highly divisible. I've had that quarter pounder with cheese. In another sense, it's not highly divisible, or it changes it to try and divide it. He pointed out that the word salary, do you guys know this? The history of the word salary? It's related to the word salt. Salt in the ancient world was such a useful commodity. We think of it as just seasoning food, but of course, it's a preservative. You can use it to clean out wounds, although you might not find that pleasant. There's all kinds of uses of salt, and they're just kind of baked into our everyday life, so we don't see it and think about it. But particularly as a
Which, by the way, makes a lot of sense of Jesus saying to the early Christians, "Be salt."
there you go.
Right?
Yeah, right. Well, it turns out this is where the word salary comes from, because Roman soldiers often were paid in salt. From the stockpile, they received their salary. And I forget the full etymology to trace it through, but you can hear it in that. But currencies have just bubbled up over time. But always there's this question of salt can lose its saltiness. Back to the Bible, right? Even that you have to use somewhat quickly. So how storable is it? Salt, apparently you're incentivized to put it to use somewhat quickly. Same thing with that cow. It'll only live so long. You've got to constantly feed it. So we've always been in search of good monies, of exchange, units of exchange between us. And it's always the best has overworld history sort of bubbled up from below, more so than been placed on the people from above, although that's what we're very used to. So maybe we don't need to work this one anymore. Maybe we just keep moving, because here we are 30 or 35 minutes in, or 27 minutes in, I guess, looking at the actual number, and we've only got one. But it's an interesting concept. Just yesterday, my wife actually did barter. She teaches piano lessons, normally for cash, but in this case, she had a favorite moccasin slipper that was coming apart, the seams. And I said to her, hey, instead of us buying a new pair at $80, $90, how about you talk with one of the students' moms who's a seamstress? And so they bartered. That was nice. That was nice. That's nice when that can happen. It's just hard to run your whole life on barter. And so money bubbles up or is placed upon us. We have it. But then we become very interested in how this money works. And probably the biggest problem with our money, one that we've highlighted time and time again, that we'll come to as we keep talking about these terms, is the fact that more of it keeps coming on the market. But guess what? Nobody's putting those extra dollars in my pocket. We had some stimmy money in 2020 and 2021. That's true. But I've never had it prior to that. I've never had it since, even if more of it is dumped on the market. Okay, next one. Next word or phrase that you'll hear often brought up is network effect. So I'll read a general description. The network effect occurs, pardon me, when the value of a product or service increases as more people use it. This will be related to some other terms later, but this principle is common in social networks, telecommunication systems, and online platforms, where greater adoption enhances usability, connectivity, and value for all participants. And I'll stop there. Here's some network effect speak for you, or a platform that somehow gained network effect. And despite the fact that competitors have come along, nobody was ever able to fully supplant it. And that would be Facebook. Facebook's a great example. I don't know if you remember, it's been probably 7, 8, 9, 10 years since Google really tried making some really concerted efforts to create a Facebook competitor. And parts of what they created were not only good, but even better. This is an interesting one. And yet, it just wasn't worth it. You'd go on there's better tools, but who's not there? Your friends aren't there, your old classmates, your mother isn't there in my case, or father, or siblings. And so Facebook got the network effect such that, as did Twitter, by the way, also, they have some overlap, but they are distinct enough to each have gained their own network effects. Competitors have come along, but they have constantly, one after the other, failed, right? So I'll stop there. Let's talk about network effect. Where do you guys see network effect in the world? And then, maybe once we've teased that out a little bit, have at it. What does network effect have to do with Bitcoin also?
I mean, I think some more good examples, not maybe technology in the
Sure.
technology sense. In some ways, the car is a network effect, right? So you think about all that is required to make a car in an interstate system and gas stations, and it's maybe part of the difficulty with the electrical EVs is the network effect of chargers and the ability to plug your vehicle in whenever you need to. That's another good example of that. Another good non sort of computery example of network effect would be air conditioners, right? Not necessarily requiring a lot, but something that's gained a massive following, if you will, that most people have them, most people use them. And then because of that, there's sort of sprinkling downward trickle effects of companies and other logistical things that need to exist because of that. But the main takeaway, David, like you said, is that as more people use something, the more entrenched it becomes. And then maybe we're going there, but the more difficult it will be to supplant that or to overcome it, even if the technology is better as well. So I'll stop there, Ben. What do you got?
Anytime that I can hold up this book and tell people to read it, I do. Neil Ferguson's The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from Freemasons to Facebook. Ferguson's point is that a lot of times historians have tried to figure out, why did this happen? Why did that happen? How did these different wars take place, or something like the Enlightenment as this movement? And he noticed that people don't often take networks seriously. It's kind of like talking about the Illuminati or something. It's kind of based on conspiracy theories, and sometimes people don't give the time of day to something like a network. And Ferguson just spends a gob of time explaining how networks are real, how they've had tremendous effects on humanity throughout the ages, and that things like hierarchies or official kind of formal groups of ruling bodies like governments, even local governments, they're not the be all end all or the only thing that exists. And so in many cases, the Reformation started from a network effect, right? Luther, maybe it wasn't exactly like this, but the legend is that Luther pounds the 95 Theses on the castle wall. The people start making copies of it. They start distributing it. The Roman Catholic hierarchy says, this is not good. Don't distribute it. And people say, yeah, well, we're going to do it anyway. And we're going to print more of these and hand it out. And all of a sudden you have a growing network of people that say, hey, I kind of think Luther's right. And I kind of think the hierarchy needs to, check its privilege. They didn't say it quite that way, but so how does this impact Bitcoin? I'll just offer one thought that I hear a lot when I talk to friends that are kind of Bitcoin curious, but they're still on the skeptical side. Almost the first thing that they say is Bitcoin doesn't have any inherent worth, and why is it worth anything at all? And the probably the best answer to that question is the network effect. If only one person in the world was running the Bitcoin protocol, Bitcoin would be just one person's hobby horse. And that's how it started out, but it's certainly not stayed there. And because there are now millions of people that are participating in the Bitcoin network, soon to probably be billions, as corporations get involved, as nation states get involved, the network effect just continues to grow. And then, the thing with networks is they're not powerful until all of a sudden they've kind of taken over a whole bunch of stuff. And all of a sudden, the Pope is realizing, oh, shoot, I'm not in control of all those German monks anymore. So pay attention to networks is the...
Yeah, I've got
Or
to
to this book.
I've got to read that book. I bet that would be my type of reading. Fascinating. I know of some, I mean, think of some network effects that are in the world around us. And I'm just spitballing a couple of these. I've not read the book. I bet there's better examples there. I can think of driving on the right side of the road. A very strong network effect. Do we have laws now that say it as well? Yes. But it started as some sort of mutual agreement somewhere and just grew and then took over. I know for a fact a network effect item in the world around us is our electrical grid, that we use AC current and not DC. That goes back to, I think it was the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Read Devil in the White City by Larson, and there's a few other books on it that aren't exactly about that, but share that. It's just fascinating how there's competing things, and yet one somehow wins the day, gets adoption, and keeps going. It's just probably more of it in our lives around us than we've stopped to contemplate. And what a curious kind of frame with which to then reevaluate a lot of these things in our life. But as relates to Bitcoin as well, here's something true about Bitcoin. Open source code, open source technology. We could literally take the code and tweak just a few things, and we could call it, I'm gonna name it after you, Ben, just because it sounds the best, better than David Coin or Jared Coin. Sorry, Jared. But Ben Coin has a ring to it. Do we all agree, right? We could start Ben Coin tomorrow. We can do that. And it can be like literally a one-for-one copy of the Bitcoin code, but I don't want to get in on it. I don't want to get in on it because it's taken Bitcoin 16 years to get to this point. And to get in on Ben Coin would undermine my last 6 years, personal 6 years in Bitcoin. And then furthermore, we have no promise that Ben Coin would go anywhere. But boy, is there trajectory right now with Bitcoin. You know, not only has it gained a network, that network seems to be growing and growing. And that's actually related to our next term. But I'll stop there before I go to the next term and give it to Jared. Did you have anything to say about network effect?
No, I think you got it all. We're going to bigger, better, pull more in. I mean, you think about early adopter, mid adopter, late adopter. That's all a function of falling under network effect, gaining more people, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And then I wrote myself a note concerning network effect. I summed it up for myself in a way that made sense to me, and it leads directly actually to our next one, where somebody tried quantifying, in a sense, network effect. But my note was this: the bigger it is, the network that is, the bigger any given network is, the bigger its gravitational pull. That's how I think of network effect. Now, networks ultimately are supplanted by other networks, and we've said that in the past. We've said that for us, having done the investigation that we've done, that we see a flaw in fiat currency. We see Bitcoin as a better tool, but we're not so dogmatic about Bitcoin to say that no better tool will ever come along. In fact, probably being open to Bitcoin has left us open to better tools as well. Or I think, Jared, you gave us a great example of that at the beginning of this, telling us about reading the Fiat Food book and how you're open to new data, right? As we all should be. All right, well, moving on then to the next term, Metcalfe and Metcalfe's law. Here's the general description of it. And as I read this, I think of Metcalfe as, again, building on that network effect language and trying to maybe quantify it. Metcalfe's law posits that the value of a network is proportional to the square of the number of its users. This principle is often applied to social networks, communication systems, and blockchain technologies where more participants create exponential value through connections and interactions. So, the addition of one new Bitcoiner to the Bitcoin network is a +1 event, but Metcalfe's law says that it's more than that. We're always squaring the number of people to gain a sense for what the addition of individuals, and we can even go more than that, individuals, corporations, pension plans, nation states, we'll come to that in a little bit as well, that they are a +1, but they're way more than a +1. That as the bigger the network, there's an exponential rise in the strength of that network. And maybe this is a short explanation, but again, I'll come up for air. What do you guys got?
I think this is most helpful to address what the second thing I usually hear most from people, Ben, is that what can you use Bitcoin for? And what we could talk about, and we have talked about all of those things, what Metcalfe's law is doing is saying, hey, the more people that use it, the more useful it becomes as well. And so when there are more people who are adopting Bitcoin, suddenly now more people, I can send it to them. They want it. They accept it. We could exchange it for goods and services. And Metcalfe's law is just an expression of that growing network effect, and that, hey, it's not just Ben and I now, but because it's him and I, it's actually more than just a 1 + 1. It's a, square of that. I guess that doesn't work because 1 squared is 1,
well,
I think. So,
but
yeah. Whatever. You know what I mean when I say that sort of thing. So that's the only thing I would add there.
This term has some sentimental value for me because it was this term and a particular theorist that I'll mention in a second that was my first exposure to a scientific view of Bitcoin and why it's worth anything. So the theorist or the writer is Timothy Peterson. He works for Cane Island Digital Research. His Twitter handle, this is where I came across him, was on Twitter or X. His Twitter handle is n²value. And he wrote this paper called Metcalfe's Law as a Model for Bitcoin's Value in January of 2018, right as the market was the first kind of bull market, or that I participated in at least. There had been a couple before that, but right as that bull market was popping, he wrote this paper, and it just made a ton of sense to me. And it was the first attempt that I had seen where, I mean, it's an academic paper. You can go on.
I want to read it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's very well researched. It's not just crypto bro writing. It's solid research, and it was published in a journal, the Journal of Alternative Investment Analyst Review. So he uses Metcalfe's law as a way to explain why Bitcoin is worth anything, and why from there he went on to write a paper and talk about how Bitcoin will never look back. And so as Bitcoin's value and the growth of it as a network continue to grow, Bitcoin's value in USD will not look back. And so he continues to chart a number of things, and one of the things that he charts is what he believes to be Bitcoin's base value going forward, that probably it will never go under again. And he's got a really impressive long track record of making calls about Bitcoin's value. And it's based not on his speculation, it's based on Metcalfe's law.
That's awesome. I need a link to that paper, Ben, and I think if we can get it in the show notes for our hearers, others might want to hear that. But yeah, that's awesome. I had no idea, Ben. That's fun to hear that little piece of history for you, your personal history. All right, I think we're going to push on to one more. We'll get one more today, and then we have a few left over, and I've even been writing down a few others that have come to mind since. So I think we'll easily have another episode. I'm actually really enjoying this episode, so hopefully our hearers are as well. The next one is called the Cantillon effect. All right. So here's a general description of the Cantillon effect. The Cantillon effect describes how newly created money benefits those closest to its issuance. We've said before, kind of colloquially, closest to the spigot, right? And those entities that it typically benefits are governments, banks, and large corporations, while devaluing money held by others through inflation. So the very act of issuing new money is the inflationary moment. That's great for you if your pockets are being lined, but if somebody's pockets are being lined with new money and it's not yours, it's hurting you. This economic phenomenon highlights the unequal distribution of wealth and purchasing power resulting from centralized monetary policies. Bottom line, if we let's just think about this. Think of the dollars that if we could freeze this moment in time, the dollars that you and I have, governments have, corporations have, churches have, and we multiplied everybody's dollars by a factor of 10. Let's just do that. 10x, right? If we did that, prices would change tomorrow. Tomorrow would be an interesting day in one sense because we'd see prices change. There'd be a zero added to the end of everything. But really, it wouldn't change anything at all because the tide went up not just for some, but for all at the same time. And so proportionally, the money you had yesterday is the same proportion of the money you have today. That would be a weird thing to do, but it would be maybe a little bit shocking, take our breath away momentarily, but it ultimately wouldn't do anything at all, right? That said, that's not what happens in the real world. New money is being issued, but it goes to those closest to the spigots. We saw this through COVID time when the initial print was $6 trillion, an amazing amount of money. I'm told that if you would start, I'm gonna pick on your family, Jared, now again. If we'd start handing Jared's family $500,000 a day, that after 4,000 years of doing this, we would only have issued you like $750 billion. We wouldn't even be to our first trillion, Jared. So $6 trillion, we struggle to grasp these, was issued out. Some of it came to stimulus to us, but it was not fairly distributed. How does this relate to Bitcoin? There is no special privilege in Bitcoin. And I'm going to say that, and I'm going to stop, and I'm going to hand it off.
This goes back to what we talked about right away when I mentioned, hey, price is up a lot. I think most people think, hey, isn't that mean you have a first mover sort of advantage, that you have an unfair advantage? And you could say yes, that, because I'm earlier, I have a cheaper dollar cost averaging. But at the same time, Bitcoin is designed so that it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if you're the CEO of the world's largest company. Doesn't matter if you have $1 jillion, which isn't even real. You still have to buy it at whatever the market price is, and you can't make more of it. And so in that way, there is no advantage. There is no privilege. It is fair game, fair level playing field for everybody from the Pope to the poorest person in Africa. They all have the same level field of play when it comes to Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think to follow up with you, Jared, I would say as we close up our last term for the day here with this Cantillon effect, is there's just, it's not always my favorite term, but there's something incredibly unequitable about that the printing of new money in our fiat world really advantages some and not all. And strangely, the people who it most advantages are the people that we probably already call the most advantaged to begin with. It's that idea of wealth creates wealth, and yet poverty is a place hard to escape from, right? And creates nothing but more poverty, you could say. And I think I could also say with you, yeah, does it appear that you have a first mover advantage? It could appear that way. But the reality is every day we are in the Bitcoin network together, my slice of the pie and your slice of the pie rise and fall with the network exactly the same. I don't get growth that you don't get, right? And on a downturn day, I don't get a pullback that affects me and doesn't affect you. Or to put it differently, actually, a pullback that affects you, but not guys like me, Jared, right? So there is something incredible about that. That is not true in a fiat system. I'll go back to that tide language. The tide rises for some and falls for others in a fiat system. And in a Bitcoin world with a fixed supply, that's the big thing there, with a fixed supply. And by the way, then each Bitcoin is interchangeable for other Bitcoin. It's not like, hey, I've got a better vintage Bitcoin than you, like it's wine or something, right? Your Bitcoin was from a bad year. That doesn't exist either. Every piece is exchangeable for another piece, and they all rise and fall together. There are no, and furthermore, then you can have somebody who we might call a whale. They have no special advantage or say over the network, over the path of Bitcoin in the future. So in that way, it's highly equitable. And for Bitcoin, the Cantillon effect is not in full effect the way it is with Bitcoin.
And I think two more things, and then we can sort of close. When we think about this too, you have to remember that 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin, right? That it doesn't matter. We don't have to be worried about someone turning the faucet on, right? The faucet is predetermined and it is set. And you and I and no one else can change that. And so I know that my Bitcoin is going to be 1 Bitcoin, and that it doesn't matter if it just doesn't matter, because there is no changing that sort of thing. But then second too, you wrote this on our sheet that I think is so important too, that what's the problem with the Cantillon effect is that it disregards, it disrespects, it degrades the work that we have. Because if I worked for 40 years, saved in dollars, and then the government just goes and prints more and I don't get any of that trickle down, then my work has just become worth less. And in some ways, truly worthless, if you will. And Bitcoin restores that, where it honors your work, that you can save it in that and hold it for the long term. And you don't have to worry about someone else unfairly getting a better advantage, unfairly receiving something that they didn't even work for or earn, but instead was just given to them. That Bitcoin takes that away, removes that incentive, and it removes the ability to do that. And that is what makes Bitcoin such a powerful alternative, that why we so desperately want people to save in it, so that they take themselves out of that fiat system into the better world that is Bitcoin.
Yeah, one of the ways this has been, said in the Bitcoin world, and maybe not just Bitcoin, but Bitcoiners have latched onto this for sure. They say, why would you work today for dollars that somebody else can print for themselves with the stroke of a button? And that's really stark. And if you really sit on that and think on that, it's actually pretty devastating. It's really devastating.
So that's where we'll call it good. We'll see you on the next one.
Take care.